Well, is it possible for these things to be in a network where they would be influencing consciousness or emotional states? Well, sure, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things I was trying to get at when I wrote that chapter in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. As to the first part of the question, are churches and so on built over certain nodal points? I talk about that very, very briefly at the end of a book that just came out called Grid of the Gods. It's the first book I've actually co-authored. A friend of mine from Oxford days by the name of Scott DeHart helped me write portions of this book. And at the end of that book, we talk very specifically about this particular fact that many churches in Europe are built on such sites. But more importantly, what really interests us is we talk about the symbolism in some of these churches that very few people fully recognize for what they are. And to put it in a nutshell, the symbolism is not Christian, it's alchemical. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but this nonetheless is the case. The short answer to the implied question there a relationship between these ideas and this corn god, debt god idea? Is yes, there is. There's a very direct one. In fact, one of the chapters in Grid of the Gods addresses the parallels in thinking between medieval doctrines of sacrifice in the medieval Latin Church and, of all people, the Aztecs. Okay? The conceptualization of sacrifice is always the same. And it's always been opposed as a kind of a black alchemy. It's always been opposed by a kind of, for want of a better expression, a kind of good alchemy, a kind of alchemy based on the notions of love, of communion, and so on and so forth. This is a huge story, and I mean, we barely even begin the story in Grid of the Gods. We're doing another book right now where we're exploring this logic and this connection a lot more deeply. But again, I want to stress that this is alchemy in the fullest and truest and deepest senses in both its black and its good forms, in that you are dealing with financial alchemy in both forms, you're dealing with a spiritual alchemy in both forms, and you're ultimately dealing with a physics. And, it's what I said in Babylon's Banksters. You have a physics of closed systems and of debt, and that's being sponsored by a certain group of people. And then you have a physics of open systems and a corresponding financial system, and that's being sponsored by other kinds of people. So this is a very, very old story. And I hope I've answered your questions. I'm trying to answer them as much as I can without spilling too many of the beans that I'm currently involved in researching.
Yes, I believe you have. A little further along with temples. How exactly, you mentioned that they have been written texts about temples functioning as low-level transmitters.
Uh-huh.
How exactly did they transmit? Did they transmit to remote areas, or did they transmit from temple to temple? Could they transmit to person?
No, it would have been, this technology would have been temple to temple. In Babylon's Banksters, and the reason I say that is I'm basing my research off of a research done by a German engineer by the name of Professor Dr. Konstantin Weil, all right, and a big, thick treatise of his that he wrote on scalar waves, in which he examines ancient temples from the standpoint of engineering optimization problems, and notices that these temples were constructed as very, very simple radio frequency resonant cavities, all right? And that means that they were probably used both to receive and transmit in a very, very narrow frequency band, and could probably only have transmitted and received by by means of telegraphy. In other words, by means of simple pulses, much like Morse code. And that means that it would have been temple to temple.
Okay. If you don't mind, another question. You also described the Egyptian pyramids as being an ancient weapon.
Yes.
Able to resonate possible destructive frequencies.
Yes.
Enough to annihilate a planet.
Yes.
Okay. And also in Africa, there are less known structures, but with similar frequency type properties. If you know about them, if you will please comment on the African stone circles that Michael Tellinger has written about. Okay.
Let me clarify what I've done in my pyramid research. I have never argued that the Egyptian pyramids, plural, were weapons. My weapon hypothesis is confined solely and exclusively to the Great Pyramid, and for very, very specific reasons. To kind of sum those reasons up, the Great Pyramid has so many inbuilt dimensional analogs of various geometric properties of local celestial space, in addition to analogs of various constants of physics and so on and so forth, that to argue, as does Chris Dunn, that it is merely a machine for the production of power does not, to my mind, adequately explain then why you would need all these dimensional analogs. So my argument comes down basically to the idea that you've got here a coupled harmonic oscillator to the geometry of local space. In other words, it is built intentionally for the purpose of manipulating the physical medium of local space directly. All right? And that means it could have most definitely a weapons application. The other pyramids, both in Egypt and around the world, I think may have been built for a machine-like purpose, yes, but a rather different one. And without getting into details, that is the reason I wrote the book, The Grid of the Gods, the one that just came out. In fact, it's so new, it just came out. My publisher just received the copies of the book yesterday, so I haven't even received my own copies of the book yet. That's how recent it's out. But my intention in writing that book is to flesh out the ideas of how other structures manipulate the physical medium and why they were built and so on and so forth. So that was the intention of The Grid of the Gods, and I hope that kind of clarifies your question and answers it.
I tell you, the subject is so fascinating. Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome.
Dr. Farrell, this is Patrick. I'll start off with an easy question.
Mm-hmm.
Are you of the opinion that phased conjugate, tunable lasers, or other advanced weaponry speculated to be in existence today might be approaching the power and destructive capabilities of ancient pyramid technologies?
Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
That's the easy one.
Yeah, that's opening Pandora's box. The short answer is, do I think such things approach that power today? The short answer is yes, and the reason why is that there are a number, and in fact I have a white paper in the members only area on my website where I talk about various patents of a very interesting nature concerning directed energy weaponry that began to be taken out in this country in the mid-1950s. So in other words, the known technology is very, very old. Now, you asked specifically about phase conjugate lasers. Phase conjugation is a very interesting, unique phenomenon that really made it into the open physics literature in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And for those listeners that don't know what phase conjugation is, to put it very simply, if you take a beam of light and shine it at a mirror at a certain angle, of course, you all know the standard optics, is that outgoing beam will reflect away from the mirror at exactly the same angle as the incoming incident beam, and do so according to the laws of the inverse square law. In other words, it will diminish with the square of the distance. The intensity will diminish. All right, the phase conjugate mirror essentially takes that incoming beam and time reverses it. It, in effect, reflects the beam back onto itself so that the inverse square law is reversed. So the beam actually intensifies and is reflected back upon the target that's producing the beam in the first place. So to say a phase conjugate laser, we're dealing with an even more sophisticated notion. And in my opinion, the short answer to that has to be yes. The perfect phase conjugate mirror for that type of thing would be a plasma. And, as I've written in a number of my books, plasmas have peculiar properties all their own. And there's no doubt in my mind, therefore, Patrick, that they have been investigating, among many other things in regard to plasma, that they've been very quietly and off the books, and part of their black projects, been investigating the use of plasmas as phase conjugate mirrors. And that would, of course, produce incredibly powerful weapons. So, yeah, do I think that they could possibly exist? Absolutely.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is related, but you might have mentioned Dr. Wood's work in passing somewhere. I came across an interesting passage in your Giza Death Star Destroyed book, and your quote was, "Any weapon using interferometry as a means to establish a disruptive standing wave in the medium would be a very powerful weapon." Yes. As you and Dr. Paul Laviette, Tom Bearden, and in Dr. Wood's book suggest, it appears to be a directed energy weapon. Could you speculate how dustification of the towers and the anomalies with toasted cars and rustifying metals might have been somehow a negative transmutation, or in other words, the dissociation of matter, by canceling out its harmonic connection to the physical realm?
Oh, boy.
That's the hard one.
Oh, boy. I have deliberately refrained in public appearances from commenting on Dr. Judy Wood's work for a variety of personal reasons. So my answer here is going to be short. Is it possible for an electromagnetic interferometry-based weapon to produce the kinds of... Hello? Did I...
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. I thought my screen went down. The dustification that Dr. Wood talks about could definitely be the effect of an interferometry producing a resonant beat frequency effect within the various materials properties of those buildings, that those buildings would not have been able to damp. In other words, you would have a kind of molecular sonic disruption, all right? The same principle